Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, greetings all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I'm delighted that you are joining me this evening. It's hot in the Northwoods today. I'm actually sweltering up here in my little attic where I'm recording this show. I hope wherever you are, your air conditioning is working, or maybe you're in a cold climate that you're snug and warm. I know I was only talking to my mother in Australia the other day who's actually suffering from COVID of all things at the moment. Apparently it's freezing in Sydney, which I'm sure isn't helping her condition. So I hope wherever you are, it's a nice temperature. I know where my guest tonight is, who I'm so excited to have back on the show. He's one of my favorite guests of all time. Is actually sweltering in Spain. And UFOs have been a significant part of the life of tonight's guest for most of his life. At 13, he discovered Erich von Daniken's work, which led him to join the Ancient Astronaut Society when he was 14. And he corresponded with figures like Zechariah Sitchin and W. Raymond Drake. In fact, I think Raymond Palmer published a Drake book, which I have on my shelf over there. And everybody who watches the show knows how obsessed I am with Palmer at the moment. And from 16 years of age, or by 16 years of age rather, he was researching UFOs and ancient phenomena at Southampton University Library. At 18, he visited the US and met authors Vaughan M. Green and Lana C. Cantrell, who influenced his perspective on ancient astronaut theories. I know he traveled elsewhere as well, and I might save that to ask him about it, actually, because it's pretty fascinating when people travel the world when they're young. I think it always broadens horizons. But back in England, after that, he began compiling historical UFO cases. And in 2003, he started Magonia Exchange, an online organization for sharing UFO research, which led to collaborations with Jacques Vallee and the publication of the book that they co-authored together, Wonders in the Sky, in 2010. He has written 9 books and is currently working on the Alien Artifact series, exploring the history of extraterrestrial beliefs from ancient Greece to 1947. Last year, he released Sources Tracing the Origins of Disc-Shaped Ufos, which I think is one of the most important books to be written on the topic in decades. And you should really go and get a copy of that book, available on Amazon. But you can also, if you want to go and listen to Chris and I chat about it, go back into the Untold Radio and Talking Weird archives and just search for Chris Aubeck, and you'll see when we chatted about that last year. But this year, he released Letters of the Damned, a collection of Charles Fort's letters, which we will be talking about tonight. And anybody who's a regular listener or viewer of the show knows how interested I am in Charles Fort and his writings. So I can't say how delighted I am to welcome back to Talking Weird one of the most insightful and significant researchers in the UFO field today, Chris Aubeck.
Hi.
Greetings. So good to have you back, mate.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Now, I'd originally planned to jump straight into Fort, but when I was reading your bio, I skipped over some of it. And I find it's fascinating when people do that very youthful travel, much like Charles Fort himself did, how it seems to open intellectual horizons. So can you tell us maybe a little bit about that world trip that you did?
Well, yeah. And I mean, in a sense, I did it at the same age as Fort too, because he was 20, and I was the first time he traveled, he was 18, then 19, 20, and I did exactly the same kind of thing. When I was 18, I actually went to the United States, and I landed in Minnesota. And the idea was to meet up with Lana Seacantrell, who you've mentioned before, who wrote a book called The Greatest Story Never Told, a massive 1,030-page volume about the degeneration of humanity from a point in antiquity when supposedly we had green skin and pointed ears and we flew around in flying cars. I was there for a few days, and she was very nice, a little bit eccentric, as you would imagine from someone who'd write a book of that kind. And then I caught a Greyhound bus, and I spent, I think it was about 4 days on this bus, because it took me from Minneapolis to San Francisco, and it was a very, very, very long trip. But I saw a lot of states. I went through Nevada and Utah. It was very eye-opening. Then in San Francisco, I met up with Vaughn M. Green, the pioneer of the Dogyu statuettes. He was the popularizer of these little Japanese statuettes it looked like they have visors and spacesuits and so on. And I stayed at his house for two weeks. Wow! And that was an amazing experience because he's one of those ufologists, or he died a few years ago. One of those ufologists who started in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and of course, in all that time, he'd met so many fascinating people. And then while I was there too, I went to a dowsers conference, or a dowsing conference in Santa Cruz in California, where simply because I was English, I attracted a lot of attention. And I was amazed how gullible people were, to be honest with you. I remember during the talks there were the rooms were just full of people, maybe 200 people. I don't remember very clearly how many people were there because it was a very long time ago, 34 years ago. But I do recall one of the speakers said, he moved his arm around like this and said that the spirits were telling him that if he moved his arm forward, that was yes, and then backwards, it was a no. And people were asking him questions. Can you contact my son who's in the afterlife, who died a few years ago? Yes. And do you have any questions for your son? Yes. Does he still love me? Yes, and so on. And people were crying, as they watched this. And that was eye-opening too. I didn't realize that anyone could believe that kind of thing. And I suppose if you're desperate enough, you will, believe that the spirits can possess a man's arm. I don't know. Anyway, then after a couple of weeks, I went back to Minnesota on another Greyhound bus, and I still had about 5 weeks left on my visa. When I was in Minneapolis, I went to a YMCA, and the manager of the YMCA there said to me, "Oh, I don't recommend that you stay here because you look very English and you look wealthy," or something, probably because of the clothes I was wearing, and I was wearing a hat. And I said, "Why don't you come to my place and you can stay there?" And I said, "Okay, but I've got like 5 weeks left on my visa." And he said, "That's fine. I'll explain on the way." So I did. I went back with him to his house, and he lived in a very large duplex with a swimming pool. And it turned out to be a kind of a center for people who'd fallen into alcoholism, and they all lived together as a kind of commune. Very friendly people, not a drop of alcohol in this house. And so he allowed me to stay there for about a month, all paid for by the American government, of course.
Huh.
And while he was there, his daughter came to stay. Her name was Kerry. I'm not going to say the surnames just in case, but if anyone wants to get in contact with me because they know these people, I'd love to say hello after so many years. Anyway, her daughter was 15 and I was 18, and after a couple of weeks, she said, "Why don't you marry me and you can stay in the United States forever?"
Wow.
And I said, "Okay, we could try that. I don't know." But we discovered that she couldn't get married until she was 16 legally. And she said, "Well, in that case, why don't you marry my mother? Because she can do that." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, I could do that. I don't know, maybe, yeah, okay." And so we went and spoke to her mum. Of course, I was 19 years old and pretty innocent. And her mum said, "Yeah, that's fine. You know, we can get married and you can sleep upstairs with my daughter. We'll get a double bed." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, then maybe." But in the end, I changed my mind and I went back to England.
Maybe for the best.
Probably. I don't know what would have happened to me if I had stayed. Then when I got to England, my parents were living in Southampton at that time, and they said, "You've got to get a job." And I decided to work in Burger King, but because I was pro-nutrition and anti-fast food in my youth. So I decided to try to destroy Burger King from the inside by collecting information about the bad practices and the lack of hygiene and so on and so forth. And I spent a year there, and I actually did put together a folder of information, and I presented it to the local health authorities, and they did an inspection and they closed the restaurant temporarily.
Goodness.
They actually fired the regional manager. And anyway, I realized that they knew that it had been me. So I thought they're going to lynch me. So I had met two people, Julian and Esther, who were Spanish. They'd been working at Burger King just to practice English for a few months. And they said, come to Spain. So I hitchhiked from the south coast of England, from Portsmouth. Well, I got a ferry, then I hitchhiked from France. I went all the way through France. I ended up in this small town where they lived called Cáceres, which is a beautiful medieval town where they've filmed Game of Thrones recently and its sequel. And I was there for 2 weeks or so when I decided to continue traveling the world, and I wanted to get to India. So I hitchhiked down to the Costa del Sol, and I was looking for a boat that would take me to Africa. I thought that would be a good idea. I had a map of the world in my pocket. It all looked very simple. And for the National Geographic, of course, this was in pre-internet times. And I was sitting in a park during Easter 1991 when late at night, and a group of people just came out of nowhere. Some yobs, they mugged me, and they threw a detergent or some kind of very strong soap in my face.
Good grief.
Left me half blind. They robbed me. And I had to go to a hospital, police, all this kind of thing. And I had a bandage over my eye, and I spent 7 weeks sleeping in the street. During that time, I was still writing about UFOs. I was carrying lots of material in my backpack. And then I worked my way back to this medieval town. My friends had left. I didn't have their next address. And after sleeping in the bus station and in an abandoned table or wardrobe or whatever it was for some time, someone said, "Why don't you give English classes?" And I said, "Yeah, that would be a good idea. I can get some money." 33 years later, here I am. And I've had all kinds of amazing jobs. And I've given classes to, for example, the president of Madrid and all kinds of people like that. And yeah, I've had a very strange life, I'd say. And of course, in the meantime, I've made all these books about UFOs and done more traveling, and it's been fun.
I'm fascinated to have heard that. I obviously knew of your importance as a UFO researcher, working with Vallee, and then, of course, as I always, every chance I get, I tell somebody to read your book Sources because it's so groundbreaking. And I'll put that up on the screen. People should get a copy. This isn't the book we're talking about tonight, but it's such an important book. And I'm somebody who has a PhD in the history of UFO belief, and I didn't know half of the stuff that you talk about in that book. I certainly didn't know the main thesis, where the term actually was popularized originally. And people should go back and watch that episode of Talking Weird as well. But most importantly, they should go out and get a copy of your book. But anyway, so yeah, having known how important you were in the UFO field, I had no idea about that fascinating backstory as far as your crazy travels as a young man. Goodness gracious.
So in a sense, I sympathize with Charles Fort, who, of course, he's the father of the supernatural, according to a lot of historians, because he popularized so many things, from UFOs to poltergeists. I mean, poltergeists had already been recognized as a phenomenon, but he popularized it for a new generation. He invented the term teleportation, for example. At least he was the first person to use it as a verb and apply it to disappearing in one place and reappearing in another. And I mean, he was born in 1874, and when he was 19, he began to travel, and he had not the same experiences as me, but he did end up in South Africa, where he got malaria and had to go back home. And he was nursed by his childhood friend, Anna, and they ended up falling in love and marrying. And then after that, they went off to London together. So in a sense, I mean, I don't compare myself to Charles Fort, but I do understand how he must have felt at a young age to want to break with everything, break the chains that you were born into, explore the world. And, you know, with all its consequences, he got malaria and had to go home sick. I ended up sleeping in the street. As I said, at very, very similar ages. And in fact, of course, I was born in 1971. He was born in 1874. And then, of course, there's another connection too, because this whole book, which is called Letters of the Damned, is all about the letters that he sent from Marchmont Street in London during the 1920s. It's all about his private research into UFOs and other phenomena of that kind. And he wrote this book while he lived at 39 Marchmont Street next to the British Museum. And as I say in the introduction of the book, if it hadn't been for that street, I wouldn't have been born, because my mother, when she was 16 years old, was working in a card shop on Marchmont Street. And one day she came out of the card shop, walked along the road, and my father was living just around the corner in Handel Street. He was under his car fixing something, I don't know what. And suddenly my dad called out, "Hey, do you want to go for a coffee?" And my mum turned around and they did. And if it hadn't been for that street where Fort was living, I wouldn't be here, I suppose.
I wonder if his spirit was somehow echoing down the ages and pointing at, there's going to be the next great Fortean, pointing at your your parents. That's an interesting question, though, that just occurred to me now. So many people use the term Fortean to apply to themselves today, usually meaning in the most casual parlance, I guess, that they're interested not just in UFOs and not just in spirits and not just in weird other anomalous phenomena, and not just in cryptids, but in all of these things. Seems to be the way that the term is used, perhaps because of the wonderful English publication Fortean Times, which is written on a broad array of these type of subjects. But do you yourself use the term Fortean as an identifier for who you are, or?
Not to identify who I am, but it's certainly a catch-all term to refer to anything that's not UFO related. Although in reality, Fort would be spinning in his grave, because everything that he wrote was UFO related. Everything from the fall of animals, what they call animal rains, frogs and fish falling from the sky, to again, the fall of strange substances, which is what he was famous for. He believed that all of this was evidence of extraterrestrial worlds. So it is true that we tend to divide the world of mysteries between UFO, Fortean, and then of course you have spiritual and ghostly and spiritualist and so on. But in reality, it was all very, very similar to him. So the word Fortean is very useful because practically anything can be Fortean. As you know from the magazine Fortean Times, anything that happens, strange deaths, disappearances, if a cow speaks or explodes, all of that would be Fortean phenomena. Although if you look at Charles Fort's books, he doesn't cover such a wide variety of phenomena as we tend to include under the heading Fortean. Simply because he was driven by his own theories, which this was one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book. Because if you look at, let's say, Wikipedia or other books about Charles Fort, they normally skip over his personal theories and motivations. They say that he didn't really offer any theories to replace the ones that he was trying to mock about anything that was orthodox science and so on. But in reality, he had very fixed, very firm theories about how all of this was linked. And that's something that you can see very easily in his letters. Because, of course, when he wrote these letters, it was an early form of crowdsourcing. He was trying to get readers of these newspapers where he published these letters to send him information. And if he had written in a cryptic way, in a very strange way, with very flowery language, which is what he does in his books, nobody would have sent him anything. He had to be more direct. And because he had to be more direct, reading his books his letters is a revelation. You can see exactly what he was talking about rather than his normal poetic prose.
It was a point I was actually going to mention to you was exactly that, the fact that, I mean, I'm obviously a big fan of Fort's writings and I have been for a long time, but they are this flow of consciousness, very dense, not very accessible, I think, for just your average reader who picks up. It's not like just picking up a book of strange mysteries and being able to just, read about the Loch Ness Monster here and, the crystal skulls here and the UFOs there. It's this very deep, weird philosophy, which he flows all over the place with, because he wanted that kind of subjectivism in his writing. He presented this idea that, or at least his books do, that perhaps the world is in flux, and so his philosophy is in flux. But in the letters, they are so precise and they're so accessible. Like if somebody wanted to have an easy insight into Fort, if they got your book, that book is so succinct and so clear in the letter writing. And the cosmology in there that's presented in the letters, and then you summarize it very succinctly, is clearer than anything in Fort's work. So maybe you could sum it up, particularly for those people who use the term to call themselves Forteans, so that they mightn't subscribe to the cosmology and the ideas that Fort's putting forward at all.
Right, yeah. So he had very specific cosmological ideas. And to us today, they seem completely nuts. And at the time, they also seemed very eccentric. But he reached these ideas through logical deduction. So, firstly, he realized that frogs and fish and crabs and snakes, when they fall from the sky, they tend to fall in the same geographical spaces every time. So maybe a field in Ohio or in a forest in Brazil or whatever. And because he'd already concluded that these were extraterrestrial living organisms that were coming to Earth, and he concluded that because he found it impossible to trace the origin of these creatures that rain down on Earth. So, for example, if they said that a certain brown crab with very long legs had fallen in, let's say, Alaska, then he would try to find the origin of that brown crab. He couldn't, and so he had to conclude that it must have come from outer space. But the fact that it kept falling into the same area could only mean, as far as he was concerned, that our planet didn't revolve on its axis. Because if our planet revolved, then these things would fall at any random point on the globe. So he reached the conclusion that the Earth doesn't revolve. And then he said, well, if the Earth doesn't revolve, the other planets are not revolving either, because again, they're all falling from the same spot in the sky. Then he said, well, maybe the Earth doesn't even go around the sun. And these were ideas that he published in his book, New Lands, and it really caught people off guard. Then, even in his first book in 1919, in the Book of the Damned, he suggested that maybe the stars were not stars, but that the solar system was encased in a kind of shell, and that the stars were holes, which sounds like an incredibly medieval idea. Then he also said that the lands in the sky, other planets and so on, were much, much closer to Earth than we think. So he believed that Mars was probably only a few hundred or thousand miles away rather than millions of miles away. And he reached this conclusion because he said, well, quite often these animals fall to Earth and they're still alive. So when one of these weird crabs or whatever, or frogs or toads land on Earth, they start to jump away, to move away. Obviously, they couldn't have come from millions of miles away because they survived the fall. So his logical conclusion was that these lands in the sky were probably quite close. And he had all of these ideas. And at the time, it actually worked to sell more copies of his books. Because if you're living in a pre-internet age, a period when there was a lot of scientific exploration, new ideas were emerging all the time, people didn't really know what to believe. They said, well, maybe some of this is true then. And a lot of newspapers put together a kind of cosmology, Charles Fort's cosmology, and presented it to people. And it had the interesting effect of attracting quite a lot of new readers or disciples to his movement. I mean, people didn't know whether this was a movement, like a spiritual, like spiritualism in the 19th century, or whether this was some kind of cult. But a lot of people were definitely attracted to this. Then what happened in the end was that when Fortean societies started popping up here and there, science had moved on. Originally, Fort was fighting with astronomers in his original books, particularly in New Lands, where half the book is dedicated to why astronomers are completely wrong. I mean, it makes the book really boring from our point of view. Then you get to the second half and it's fine again. But the whole first half of it is him fighting with the world of orthodox astronomy. But by the mid-1930s, and he died in 1932, Fortean societies realized that Fort must have been wrong about most of this stuff. So their reaction was, well, there were two different reactions. The first one was to turn what Fort had theorized about into a kind of metaphor. So they would treat everything as a metaphor for rebelling against the establishment. I believe that Fort proposed most of this quite seriously, at least at the beginning. So I don't think he was being metaphorical at all. And the other thing that these associations did was to totally ignore all of that content out of his books, which was not too difficult to do. It's a little bit like Christians ignoring the whole of the Old Testament, acknowledging that it exists, taking out the little bits that they enjoy, and just ignoring everything else about stoning mediums and homosexuals or whatever, or putting people to death. So it wasn't that difficult intellectually to ignore most of what Charles Fort thought about the universe. But it makes very interesting reading today when you slice through what we believe about Charles Fort and go directly to his true theories. It's a bit shocking, to be honest.
I'll be honest, it was shocking, because I do consider myself a Fortean in the true sense, not as somebody just interested in weird phenomena, somebody who, in a way, the way I always imagine Fort is fighting this rearguard action against positivism and about, the scientific establishment and almost the new religion of science. I've always appreciated Fort for those capacities, and I've always, reading his actual books, seen there's a humor in him. He's almost a humorist in a lot of it, which doesn't come across in the letters. Like, the letters are surprisingly free of the type of the quips, not entirely, but far less than in the books, where you can read the books and think he's just taking the PISS, right? But in the letters, it seems like he's far more serious.
Yeah, that's right, because he wanted to be published in serious newspapers. I mean, what he did in London was he'd spend the mornings at the British Museum Library. He'd make copious notes from every journal that caught his eye. He'd write everything on little rectangle pieces of paper, often actually carrier bags from the shops. He'd just rip them into pieces and write his notes on there. And he collected tens of thousands of notes this way. Then he'd go home, have lunch with his wife, and then spend the afternoon either writing letters, as we can see. There were 71 letters in the book. I know of about 80, I'd say, altogether, but some were a little bit too repetitive, even for this collection. He probably sent out more than 150 or even 200, and I imagine we'll be finding Charles Fort's letters forever in newspaper collections as they become available to us, because a lot of libraries are scanning their old newspaper archives as we speak. And then he would go out in the evening with his wife around London and enjoy the parks and the city life and so on. And yeah, that was his lifestyle for a long time. And those letters were a big part of that. As I said, it was a kind of crowdsourcing. He wanted to contact as many people as possible. So every time he found a strange case, for example, a UFO in India or in Hong Kong, he'd write a letter to the newspaper that had originally published this like 30 years before. And if it didn't exist anymore, he'd just find the address of a similar newspaper in the same area and say to people, if you have any proof at all, anything, a dried fish or just a memory of this or something in a scrapbook at home, send it to me. And it's interesting because I don't think there had ever been anyone doing that before him. Nobody had been so incredibly dedicated to this. And he reminds me of a lot of modern researchers who would do exactly the same thing, but of course he would do it by email these days. But he had to be serious in these letters, or otherwise newspapers wouldn't publish it. They just say, "What is this?" In fact, there are a few newspapers that where they published fragments of his letters, mocked him, and didn't even write his London address so readers could respond unfortunately. And a lot of these I couldn't add to the book because they're just too fragmented. But yeah, it's a very different experience to read his letters from reading his books.
I love that too, because I've always thought of Ford as the bespectacled man sitting in the British Library going through old newspaper and magazine files and extracting this information, which he clearly did. But to know he was actively sending letters to various regions, trying to get original eyewitnesses who might still be alive to be able to tell him more. And he often says, like, maybe we'll get closer to working out what happened, or there'll be a great revelation or something like that if you come forward. I found that so interesting and charming, and a part of about Fort that I knew very little. Something else I knew a little bit about, but the book filled in so much more, and I was so grateful it was in there, that his lost or his burnt manuscript for a book called X, which I was aware of, but there is a letter you found and your own comments on there, because some of your notes in there are just absolutely fantastic as well. But can you tell us a little about his ideas in X, which come forward in a letter to a magazine or a paper that I'd never read before?
He wrote two books, which he ended up burning, X and Y. And X was I mean, what we know about them is pretty fragmentary. In X, he postulated that there were beings on Mars who invisibly controlled human civilization. And this is why he's famous for saying, "We are property." And this is one of his very famous statements. Because he reached the conclusion that we are property of Martians. I mean, Martians were the extraterrestrials, the Greys, or whatever of the day. You would call them Martians. In one of his letters, he actually says that humans probably are a life force, like an energy battery for extraterrestrials, and that explains why they don't land on Earth. They don't openly land here on the White House lawn or whatever, because they have no interest in playing with their food, because we, in a sense, are the givers of life force to them, in the same way that we see in the Matrix movies. Where humans are imprisoned in pods of some kind, and so that the AI of the future could take our life air force. It's never really explained very well in Matrix, but anyway, how we're sort of giving them our electricity for them to power their world and their I don't know, servers or whatever it is. So he had very advanced ideas in that sense. But it's amazing to think that he would have been the author of the first UFO book. His other book, Y, it was called simply with a Y. I mean, these were not the titles he would have used in the end. He would have given them proper titles, but Y was all about a mysterious civilization at the South Pole or the North Pole. Sorry, I think it was the South Pole, and how maybe there was some kind of alien base there. I mean, considering he was writing in the 1920s, and he was backing up these theories with cuttings from the press, it's clear that if he had published these books, the history of ufology would have been totally different from what it is today. Nobody would have even heard of Kenneth Arnold. Everybody would be talking about Charles Fort. Charles Fort would be the father of ufology. Unfortunately, he burnt these books before we had the chance to see them. I mean, other people did read them and commented on them and said, "Wow, this is out there. This is something else. This is amazing." But he couldn't get a publisher, and that was it. If he'd lived just like 40 years later, he would have got a publisher very quickly. Because in the 1960s or whatever, people would have lapped all of this up.
Palmer would have been chasing him for copy, just like he chased Arnold for copy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that was something that it was so intriguing to me. And when you were talking then about how Fort conceived that these beings somehow used us as an energy source or a food source, of course, John Keel, who I think is one of the true great Forteans after Charles Fort, he said something similar in his ultra-terrestrial thesis. He thought these things were appearing to us because somehow they were using us for energy. And I thought, I wonder if that, I mean, Keel just developed that, you know, like maybe like Fort said, when it's time for an idea emerges. Maybe Fort's idea had to wait for John Keel or had to wait for the Wachowskis. You know, maybe it wasn't quite ripe then. And it took a little while to get out there.
Yeah, it's interesting how that often happens. There's a Russian expression. It's something like this idea wants to happen, or this text wants to be written. The idea that things sort of come into existence because they will themselves into existence. And of course, the way that ideas can emerge probably independently in the same space of time. So John Keel could come up with that idea. In Spanish, there's a writer called Salvador Freixedo, an old guy who also died some years ago. He wrote a book called The Human Farm, I believe, La Granja Humana. And it was a very similar idea, the idea that people were somehow a kind of big farm for some experiment run by extraterrestrial beings. But, you know, Charles Fort had a lot of ideas which had been, that had existed in other periods. Like he thought that maybe dinosaurs had fallen to Earth from another planet. And this idea, I doubt very much he'd come across this himself, but this was a very popular idea in French in the 1860s, which is what I explore in my book, Alien Artifacts, which is I have one here. You have this one here. I'm writing the volume 2 now. Hopefully it'll be by October.
Excellent. You're prolific. I don't know how you
I don't like making
incredible quality.
It's like 40 degrees here, but it's 104 Fahrenheit, and it's like I get up in the morning with these great ideas. Like I'm gonna like spend all day writing, and then I'm going to publish this tonight, and then it doesn't happen because I'm like, oh God, why am I living in this place? Like working in the jungle. In any case, there was the idea that dinosaurs had fallen to Earth in ancient times as extraterrestrials was popularized in the middle of the 19th century, which was also built on the fact that the first ancient aliens theory, I mean, a real, genuine von Däniken type theory that our ancestors came from outer space, that was published in 1823, making this the 201st anniversary of that theory. And that was in this book here, which I managed to get after I published this. I would have like used pages from this to decorate this otherwise, but it was very, I think this, I was trying to find out how many copies of this still exist. I think there's something like 5 or something like this. It probably wasn't well, I mean, I don't think the guy who wrote this, Francois Chabrier, made too many copies of it anyway, but it's from 1823, and here it just says that our ancestors came from another planet, or at least human culture was deeply influenced by remnants of an alien civilization that fell to Earth. And even though Charles Fort doesn't develop his own ancient astronaut theory, I think that he was only about 5 years away from coming up with that, or maybe it would have been in one of his unpublished manuscripts, because I think that he was heading in that exact direction. And it's also true that he developed this way of looking at the world, which it's very similar to W. Raymond Drake's way of doing things. I don't know how well known Drake is in the United States.
Palmer published. I have one of his books. I had some in Australia as well in paperback, but I have a Palmer published one here, which was published down the road.
Amherst Press.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Gods and Spacemen.
That's the one.
1964. I've got it here too in the hardback version, which I bought from eBay. And
beautiful cover too. There's this kind of strange face on floating in space or something. Beautiful cover.
A jade mask. I think it's an Aztec jade mask with a rocket flying by, with a space background. I mean, I used to talk to him on the phone. Wow. And it was fun when I was about 15, 16 years old. And he told me that once that he believed that UFOs were piloted by angels from heaven, which is something that he never wrote about, but he said that nobody would believe him if he did. But this is so similar to what Kenneth Arnold believed privately, which was that, I've spoken to his daughter and his granddaughter, and I've read other interviews. And Kenneth Arnold said that he thought that UFOs were a kind of messenger that helped us transcend into the next world. And
he shared that idea with Raymond Palmer as well, because Palmer was very influenced by Oahspe, the New Age-esque Bible from the 19th century. And it had this idea of different beings and for different spiritual levels. And for Palmer, it could explain UFOs. It could explain the Shaver mystery. It was able to fit all of these apparently nuts and bolts physical ideas into a far more spiritual thing. So I think that's one of the reasons that Palmer and Arnold got on so well, because they shared that kind of an idea.
Yeah, and then Arnold carried around these business cards, which weren't really business cards. They were souvenir cards. And on the one side, he had his crescent-shaped flying saucer that wasn't saucer-shaped at all, and then on the other side there was a quote from this book, Oahspe.
I'd love one of those cards. I need to keep my eye out for one.
The only one that still exists, as far as I know, is what Kim has, Kim Arnold, and she sent me a scan of one, and then I couldn't really use it. I mean, I did scan it and I put it in my book Sources, but I had to recreate the card myself to use it as illustration for a previous chapter, and it was fun, looking for the same font and everything, and I made it look pretty authentic. But I was going to say that W. Raymond Drake had a very special way of looking at myths and folklore and legends. So you'd find a story about a golden chariot and a giant and whatever flying around the world, I don't know, lighting the stars. And then he would say, well, this is probably a garbled version of a UFO that was seen by people firing lasers and so on. and then Charles Fort does exactly the same thing. One of the letters that I put in the book is about an abduction, which is interesting. So he's also one of the first people to speculate about alien abductions, and it was all about a monster that sort of comes out of nowhere and grabs a swimmer and then disappears with the swimmer under the water. And he, as far as Charles Fort was concerned, maybe this was a garbled version of an alien abduction. And he did a very similar thing too and it's in the book several times because he loved the case. He spoke about it again and again, about a bishop who saw a torpedo-shaped object in the air. Really, it wasn't too far away. It wasn't too far off the ground, and it had flames coming out of it, and there was an explosion, and then it flew off. And it is pretty inexplicable. And I do believe that this bishop saw something. But again, Charles Fort believed it was a garbled version of an alien spaceship that was either crashing on Earth, making him again a pioneer in the sense of crashed UFOs, or the ship was actually attacking this town in North America. And so this way of looking at myths, folklore, and so on, and reinterpreting it with space-age eyes, which is what Drake often said to me, is something that really probably began with Charles Fort.
You know, it's interesting because your book has made me ask myself a number of questions personally, because as I said, I'm somebody who does identify to a degree as what I've always considered a real Fortean. But one of the strengths I've thought of being a real Fortean and in following Charles Fort to some degree, or to his thinking to some degree, is that there's a flexibility and there's a changeability in interpretive expressions or interpretive understanding of these things, much like Ray Palmer did. Like, he liked the waspy, but he played around with ideas, and I've always appreciated that. But the letters seem to suggest that Fort had a very, as we talked about in the cosmology a minute ago, that he seemed to be able to use the idea of other worlds near us and things visiting us to explain everything from strange fish falls to strange rock falls to UFOs to lake monsters to dinosaurs. So it seems like it really wasn't something I'd thought about before. It seems like he had a very almost unified theory of the weird, which revolved around there being planets, and sometimes he talks about them potentially I know he talks about Mars, like you said, but at other times in the letters he seems to be saying, well, maybe there are invisible worlds even closer to us that we can't see, that these things are falling from. But whatever, it seems in the letters that you've published that was what he used as a lens to interpret so much of the weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I think that we have to remember that he didn't cover every possible mystery or supernatural phenomenon in his books. And as I said at the beginning, these days Fortean really sort of covers a wider range of phenomena than it did originally. He just, I mean, I don't want to say cherry-picked because it doesn't sound nice, but it's true that he was picking simply the phenomena that would fit into his cosmological theory about non-rotating planets that were quite close to Earth. And so, yeah, as far as we're concerned, all of these phenomena were connected in his mind. But then again, he doesn't stray into talking animals and whatever, because that wouldn't have had anything to do with his basic theories. But the problem, of course, is that in his books, he doesn't make this very clear at all. So his books are a kind of, in a sense, his books are a symbol or a metaphor, because most people won't read them ever. Most people will know about Charles Fort as being a very important person who was born on August the 6th, 1874. So this is his 150th anniversary. But they won't ever read his books. And I think it's because you need a cipher, a key to understand it. The interesting thing about the letters is that it actually works as a kind of cipher. It helps you understand what he was really talking about, what he was, so if you go back to the Book of the Damned, and he talks about stars in the sky as kind of holes that light comes through, and then why is he suddenly dedicating pages and pages to fallen fish? What's the point? I mean, now we understand that through the letters. We can really see how all of this fits together, and it's really interesting. And I would say that it's important because when I was younger, I remember picking up so many books about weird mysteries and UFOs and so on. And you often found a short chapter on falls of fish and frogs, angel hair connected with UFO cases, all this kind of thing. And when you read it when you're younger, you simply accept that all of this is part of some mystery. But you never really know why it's interesting, or you never know why it's all connected. And I do mention in the book that I've spoken so often to researchers and said, so the other day you published an article about lights in the sky, and now you've published an article about frogs that fell in Germany during the rain. Why? You know, if it's just a meteorological phenomenon, because it really is a meteorological phenomenon, why are you writing about that? Why not write about rainbows? You know, and they often say, I don't know. it's just one of those things that we write about. And then through the letters, you can see the reason that it's all connected. The angel hair, for example, Charles thought that it was this was some substance that fell from the sky. I don't think he was against the idea that it could be cobwebs, and it really is cobwebs. But he believed that it had an extraterrestrial source. So when you get to the 1950s, the time of Adamski and that kind of author and whatever, and they start to connect angel hair with UFO cases, because they began to read Charles Fort's books looking for some kind of support for their own theories about extraterrestrials and flying saucers. They come across angel hair cases and they say, well, I can use that. So when I saw a UFO, or when whoever saw a UFO, interesting, there was this angel hair. And we can find that in Charles Fort. And that shows that this phenomenon didn't just begin in 1947. It's a much older and well-established phenomenon, etc., etc. And it's a bit like this this other substance called, I don't know how to pronounce it. It was poudre serre. It's these puddles of mush, this sort of transparent jelly, star jelly it's called sometimes, which you can also find probably in John Keel's books and a lot of these other writers of the 1950s and 60s. And they also say, well, this is somehow related. And it wasn't related to UFOs at all. It was simply in Charles Fort's books. So it really does sort of open your mind in that sense. And, you know, it explains why it's all a part of UFO belief or folklore even today.
Indeed. I think Palmer did an awful lot to bridge that gap as well, because in so many amazing stories, editorials in the mid-1940s into the late 1940s, when Palmer's interested in pushing the Shaver mystery, he references Fort again and again and again. So even before the Kenneth Arnold sighting, Palmer was attaching Charles Fort to this kind of mystery. And of course, Vincent Gaddis, that you and I were talking in chat the other day, was writing articles, who was a great Fortean of the 1940s, was writing articles prior to Kenneth Arnold's sighting in Amazing Stories, talking about these kind of things. I did have one other question for you, and this is a question just which interests me personally. Hopefully it will be of an interest to the readers as well. I've read the Fort biographies, like by Steinmeier and by Damon Knight, and of course Colin Bennett's Politics of the Imagination. And in many ways, Bennett's Politics of the Imagination has been my go-to interpretation of Fort. I think because I already kind of agreed with it before I read Politics of the Imagination, but I like this suggestion that somehow Fort was somehow protecting an older romantic tradition in this kind of, you know, this wave after wave of, you know, the establishment of the scientific institution being the new authority of reality, the new arbitrator of reality. And somehow a Fortean interpretation was kind of spitting in the eye of science, which to a degree Charles Fort definitely does. But having read your letters, or your collection of letters and your interpretation of the letters, which I think is dead on, it does seem to be, I don't know, I guess the question for you is, do you think it challenges that Colin Bennett or my type of interpretation, that Fort was essentially just presenting himself as some type of, I don't know, dam against this almost overflowing, you know, waters of science, which were just wiping out our kind of interpretation of everything? Do you think, I don't know, what's your interpretation of that type of position?
So until I began collecting the letters myself, I also thought that Fort was just mocking and playing around with ideas that went against the scientific grain, just for fun, really. And there's this idea that that Fort never took his own theories seriously. And in the chapter that I published, there's a short summary there that I'm trying to prepare the reader for what's coming next, which is basically Fort's cosmological ideas. I do go into this a little bit. And it's on Wikipedia. If you look at Wikipedia, it says that authors like Jerome Clark have reached the conclusion that Fort didn't take his ideas seriously, because there's a point in which Charles Fort said in one of his books, I don't believe in any of this myself. But in reality, I had to quote the whole passage from his book in my chapter on his cosmology to show that that's to totally misunderstand what Fort was talking about. He was saying that we shouldn't accept any doctrines, any doctrination. We should think for ourselves, and whether it's the Bible or a Messiah or a scientist or he himself, the best thing to do is not believe anything without questioning it first. And that is what he really says. I think that he had a series of theories which he built up from evidence that he'd collected, and he loved to play around with mocking the scientific establishment in his books, but he believed that by doing this, his theories would somehow shine through. It didn't really work because nobody understood what his true theories were. But another point that I make in Letters of the Damned was that he spent years and years ruining his eyesight, looking for more and more data. And he had tens of thousands of little cards stored away. There's a photo at the start of the book from 1931, I believe it is, and Charles Fort is standing there proudly posing next to these boxes of his notes.
I'd never seen that photo before, by the way, so I'd love to see it.
Yeah, and it's right at the start of the book, and I don't like publishing photos without getting some kind of permission, even if no one's ever going to say anything, because it's incredibly old. I found the copyright holders, and unfortunately they told me that the original photograph doesn't exist anymore. I tried to improve it a little bit in Photoshop, but the point is that Fort is standing there a year before he died, I suppose, with his note collection. Even though he had so many tens of thousands of notes that he'd never used in his books, he was still determined to get more and contact the witnesses. And he destroyed. I mean, he basically went blind, and that's the reason he had to leave London and go back to New York. Because he couldn't see anymore. You wouldn't do that unless you had a very strong conviction that you were onto something in your research. You wouldn't destroy your eyesight in this way against your wife's warnings and the doctor's warnings and whatever, unless you really felt driven. I mean, he wasn't an old man. He looked like an old man when he was 19. He wasn't really an old man. I mean, he died in his 50s, but he just looked incredibly old. So obviously, he took his own ideas incredibly seriously, and I think that's something that's been lost over time because of this stupid rumor that he didn't believe even in his own theories. I'm always hoping that the people who edit Wikipedia, and I know that I could do it myself, but I'm always hoping that somebody will go to the page on flying saucers and use my book to correct some of the myths, and then go onto the Charles Fort page on Wikipedia and correct some of these things too. Never really happens, but
well, that's a challenge for a listener to go out and fix both of those: the Charles Fort Wikipedia page and the flying saucers or UFOs page. Get Chris's books first, though, so you can reference it properly. It was so wonderful chatting to you tonight. How do people get a hold of your book or get a hold of like what you're up to? There's some URLs you can throw out or some sites you can point them at.
Okay, so I use Amazon these days to publish books. I mean, I've gone through the traditional publishing channels in the past. Wonders in the Sky was published through Penguin, for example. But I find that these books are more dynamic, and I have more control over the content and how to illustrate them, and they're faster to publish if I do it myself. So Amazon is the place to go to buy these books. Some people have said to me in the past, "Oh, I hate Amazon with their monopoly," and it's like, yeah, but I'm not thinking about that. I mean, life is short. Let's use the tools that we have at our disposal, and so it's all on Amazon. Then to contact me, they can try Facebook, but I've got something like 4,998 friends, and I don't always manage to add more people or see messages that come my way. But my email address is at the back of all my books, so that's easy. It's CAUBECK, Chris, C, and then Aubeck altogether, and then it's at gmail.com. So it is pretty easy to contact me. What I'm going to do, I tried to do this in July, but it was just too hot. It's taken me a month just to get used to the weather here. I mean, it's ridiculous how hot it is. Anyway, I tried to pump out one book every 2 days through the month of July, and I just couldn't manage it. But in August, my aim is to publish a Fortean library, which will be each volume dedicated to a particular subject. For example, one that I've practically finished is about entities that travel around in balls of light or fire. They sort of turn back into the entity again. There's an encounter or whatever, and then they turn back into a ball of fire and they fly off. There's so many like that, and some of them are fascinating. There are some 19th century stories about fireballs, and when the fireball expands and becomes a person, it's a naked man. And this is so similar to Terminator, Anyway, so that's one of the volumes in this series that I want to bring out. If you look at the back of Letters of the Damned, you can see it says Fortean Library. I think it was his collection. I don't remember because I'm still making it.
Fortean source books.
Source books. That's the word that I came up with in the end. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing at the moment, and I have just so many projects. I think one of the books I'm going to write in August, and literally I'm going to dedicate the whole day to just gathering my notes. A lot of these manuscripts are already half written anyway. I just think I need to sort them out a little bit. Is going to be about the first ufologists or alien hunters in history, going back to the 18th century and Emanuel Swedenborg, and then and then like 6 or 7 names in the 19th century, and then as we get into the 20th century, leading up to Charles Fort. And I just want like very short book, short and cheap, but basically it's going to be one chapter dedicated to each alien hunter or ufologist through history. I have so many books like this lined up, and I just wish I were 19 years old and I could like turn them into interesting YouTube videos rather than books. But I'm afraid an old fogey like me, I just turned 53 like 2 or 3 days ago.
I saw happy birthday. I saw on Facebook after your birthday, though. I meant to say happy birthday tonight. So.
Thank you very much. I mean, I don't really pay much attention to. I always feel quite guilty because so many people write "Happy birthday, Chris" and whatever, and on Facebook and through messages. And because I never look on Facebook, I never know when it's someone's birthday. So I go into into Messenger and I see that some random person said "Happy birthday" over the last 9 years, and I've never acknowledged it, and I feel so bad. But what I've done this year, I've started because I felt quite bad about it. So I've started recording voice messages, personalized ones to each of these people to see if I can feel better about it. But anyway,
you're as dedicated as your birthday messages as you are to your books. I mean, I'm astounded, and I honestly can't encourage people enough to go and get a copy of your two most recent books, Sources, which we didn't talk about tonight, but it's absolutely spectacular, tracing the origins.
This is my main thing, to be honest.
And Alien Artifacts. We have to get you on to talk about that as well at some stage. And Letters of the Damned, which we talked about tonight, because. And I have lots of guests on. I'm interested to talk to everybody, but anybody who watches this show regularly knows that I don't say this. You are one of the most important researchers writing today, and you are one of the handful of writers that I think are actually saying something that is worthwhile in the field today. So people should really read your books. Yeah,
sure. I hope people can steal a copy, pirate a copy, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Buy it. Support this research. I'll say this now just quickly. I'm somebody in the press, and Chris would send me his books for free if I asked him to, but I always buy them because I want the hardcovers on my shelf because they're so good. But the research is such a high level of research. Not to support it is almost criminal. So thank you so much for coming on to chat with me tonight, Chris. It was a great joy, as it always is.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
It was my pleasure. And until I get to chat to you again, Chris, and until I get to chat to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.